Shalom, welcome back. So I'm continuing on with this series of answering the skeptics, and I'm trying to give some explanation to common objections that people bring forward with regard to the testimony of Keifa and the doctrines of the Nazarenes. I just want to make a note about the last video before we continue. I was talking about in Genesis chapter 9 where Noah's coming off the ark, and it appears that he's being told, you can go ahead and eat whatever animal you want. And the word for moving creatures is actually the creeping things. And so I made the point that he's actually being told that you can eat the cold-blooded animals, like the snakes and lizards and bugs and stuff like that. One thing I didn't mention is that I don't think that Yeshua actually gave Noah that commandment. So we talk about things that are added and things that are not. I couldn't picture Yeshua telling his prophet Noah to go ahead and eat bugs, to go ahead and eat unclean animals. If you weren't supposed to eat animals at all, I certainly don't think he would have told him to go ahead and eat unclean animals. So that's one of the things that it doesn't fit with the nature of Elohim. But that was really not the point of my video. The point was just to say, look, this doesn't say what you think it says. It says that he can eat lizards. I don't know anybody that sits around and eats lizards and ants and cockroaches and snakes and stuff like that and uses Genesis chapter 9 to justify that. Usually it's people eating warm-blooded animals, cows and pigs and sheep and things like that. So that was really the point, was not to justify the ability to eat creeping creatures. It was just to say, hey, look, this doesn't say what you think it says. So as promised, now we're going to move on to why did Moses write that we can eat meat in Leviticus 11? And so we're going to start off just looking at Leviticus 11. It's the dietary commands. It starts off that Yeshua spoke to Moshe, said to them, speak to the children of Israel. These are the living creatures which you eat among the beasts that are on the earth. And he goes on to describe the different clean and unclean animals and to give us these dietary commandments. Now, before we go any further, since we are talking about Ebionites and Nazarenes and that sort of thing, we can look at what Barnabas says in his epistle about this subject. And so Barnabas, starting at chapter 10, he says that Moses said, you will not eat the swine, the eagle, the hawk, the crow, or any fish that has no scales. He had three principles in mind, for at the end he enumerates them in Devarim, or Deuteronomy. I will place before this people my Torah, so this is not Elohim's commandment about crunching or chewing. Rather, Moshe spoke in the Spirit about swine. You will not cleave to a piggish people of this sort. And he goes on to look at the different types of unclean animals, and then Barnabas relates that to a type of person and says it's supposed to be an allegory to tell you what kind of company to keep, not what kind of food to eat. Now, just to set the record straight, I'm not a fan of turning things into allegories that I can't see that it's meant to be an allegory. In other words, in Keifa's vision in Acts, where he has this blanket come down with animals on it, it's obvious it's meant to be an allegory, and Keifa even interprets it as an allegory. He says it's not about eating animals, it's about people. Pretty much the same analogy that Barnabas is drawing here, that the eating the animals in Leviticus is not about animals but people. But the difference is, in Keifa's vision, it's obviously meant to be symbolic, whereas in Leviticus chapter 11, it's not obvious that it's symbolic. It's in the form of a commandment. Now, in the Nazarene Acts, Keifa talks about how sometimes when you're presenting something to a mixed group of people or a large crowd, you can't always just tell people that these difficult scriptures are something that's been added by men, because people are so wrapped up in this whole inerrancy of Scripture thing that they'll just scoff at you and reject you because they're not ready to handle that level of truth. So you've got to figure out a way to explain these verses, at least initially, until the person gets a little bit more initiated, so that then you can tell them the truth about this stuff being added. And that may be what Barnabas is doing, but the point is that Barnabas, if he is a representative of the early Nazarenes, this demonstrates that they did not believe that Leviticus 11 was about food. But again, I'm not necessarily a big fan of this interpretation, but I did feel like I should at least share it. But if we look at what Keifa says, and so we go to homilies, we start in homily 3, chapter 45. Keifa says, "But that he," speaking of Elohim, "he is not pleased with sacrifices is shown by this, that those who lusted after flesh were slain as soon as they had tasted it, and were consigned to a tomb, so that it was called the grave of lusts." Now, if you want to find that in the Torah, just turn to Numbers 11:34, and that's where you hear about this grave of lust, where the people were lusting after meat. "He then, who at the first was displeased with the slaughtering of animals, not wishing them to be slain, did not ordain sacrifices as desiring them, nor from the beginning did he require them." So notice that Keifa is relating sacrifices to eating meat. This is something that's a little difficult for people in the modern Western world to understand, but sacrificing an animal in the ancient Near East was directly related to eating meat. In fact, the reason that the children of Israel were always so involved in idolatry was because you would go to the idols at these pagan temples. That's where you would go to get meat. So going to visit an idol is like going to Burger King to have a Big Mac or a Whopper. I've been away from meat for so long, I can't even remember what the signature burgers are at these burger places. But it's not just about eating meat, but you would also go to these idolatrous temples for, like, temple prostitutes and stuff like that. So what we see and what we probably envision is just them going to this big statue and bowing down. There's actually more involved than that. It would be like going to a barbecue. So the two are not separable. In fact, if you start reading scholarly books, anthropological type of books that study these ancient Near Eastern cultures, they'll confirm that for you. These scholars and people that study this, they understand that the two are completely interrelated. You can't separate them like we do now. To us, going to McDonald's to get a Big Mac is far different than slaughtering a sheep on an altar. Far different. But in the ancient Near East, the two were the same. So notice this, though. "He then who was at the first displeased with the slaughtering of animals." So when you see at the first, that should immediately make you think of the book of Genesis. He was displeased with the slaughtering of animals. And I mentioned this in the last video, but I'm going to go ahead and read through it for those of you who did not watch the last video. In Homilies 8, starting at chapter 15 and going into chapter 16, Keifa says, "But they, the Nephilim, on account of their bastard nature, not being pleased with purity of food, longed only after the taste of blood. Wherefore they first tasted flesh, and the men who were with them there for the first time were eager to do the like. Thus, although we are born neither good nor bad, we become one or the other, and having formed habits, we are with difficulty drawn from them. But when irrational animals fall short, these bastard men tasted also human flesh, for it was not a long step to the consumption of flesh like their own, having first tasted it in other forms." Several years ago, I met a gentleman who was translating the Book of Enoch from the original Ge'ez Ethiopian language into English. And when he was speaking about the Book of Enoch, now the Book of Enoch says the same thing. It says that the Watchers produce these Nephilim, and then the Nephilim began eating meat, and before long, men were eating meat because they learned it from the Nephilim, and that led to animals eating each other. And before long, the creation was basically consuming itself. And so this gentleman made the point, and it's stuck with me since then, that the thing that we are to learn, his impression of the story of the Nephilim, is that we are not to do what the Nephilim did. And that goes into a lot more than just eating meat. There were other things that the Nephilim did that we're commanded not to do. But then when the animals fell short, when they fell short of food, they began to eat human flesh. And as I mentioned in the last video, this reminds me of the story of the fall of Jerusalem. Josephus gives us a very detailed account of a woman during the fall of Jerusalem who was eating her own children. And it's not that much of a stretch to move from eating animal flesh to eating the flesh of other people. So if Yahuwah does not change, and if he did not desire animals to be slain and eaten back prior to the flood, why would he change and suddenly be okay with it? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with what we know of Yahuwah. We go back to the homilies in another area. This is book 7, chapter 4. And we ask, what are things well-pleasing to Elohim? And Keifa tells us to pray to him, to ask from him, to recognize that he is the giver of all things, and that he gives with discriminating law, to abstain from the table of devils, not to taste dead flesh, not to touch blood, to be washed from all pollution, and the rest, in one word, as the God-fearing Jews have heard, do you also hear, and be of one mind in many bodies. Let each man be minded to do to his neighbor those good things he wishes for himself. So, this not tasting dead flesh, notice he doesn't say it's only talking about when it's sacrificed to an idol. There is no specification that it's only speaking about dead flesh has been offered to an idol. It says dead flesh, period. Not to touch blood. And which that goes beyond even what we're told not to eat blood. Keifa saying that it's pleasing not to even touch blood, which sounds very similar to what the commandment that James gives in the book of Acts, to abstain from blood. I had a gentleman tell me one time that he was praying about and I guess kind of meditating on this subject of eating of meat and whether we should be slaughtering animals and making sacrifices with them. And he heard Yahuwah speak to him and say, you know, when I created the animals, I created them with the blood in them. I never asked for blood to be shed on the ground, to be spilt on the ground. It's always the adversary that wants blood spilt on the ground. And he couldn't understand that. He couldn't understand why Yahuwah would have told him that if it wasn't true. Like if the Bible says one thing, why would the Heavenly Father tell him something else? And it was after he heard me speaking on this subject, I think that he really got his answer. Because a lot of people don't put all this stuff together. And this reminds me of something that Yeshua said to the Pharisees. It says in Matthew 19, and the Pharisees came to him, trying him, and saying to him, is it right for a man to put away his wife for every reason? And Yeshua answered and said to them, did you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what Elohim has joined together, let man not separate. And the Pharisees said to him, why then did Moshe command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away. And Yeshua said to them, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moshe allowed you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. Now, people have read this in the New Testament for 2,000 years and not had much of a problem with it. Because Yeshua is taking a commandment that's in the Torah to give a woman a certificate of divorce, and he's saying it was never commanded by Elohim, that it was something that Moses had allowed the people. It was an allowance given by Moses, not necessarily by Elohim. And Yeshua appeals to the opening chapters of the book of Genesis to justify his statement. Would this not be true, or could you not do the same thing when it came to eating meat? Because the first chapter of Genesis states that we were given a diet of every green tree and fruit-bearing tree and every green plant. And so in the beginning, people didn't eat meat. In fact, it wouldn't really be that difficult. If you look at what is written here in yellow, why did then Moshe command to give a certificate of divorce, is very similar to the question that we're exploring. Why did Moses write that we can eat meat? In fact, you could take this statement, this exchange with Yeshua and the Pharisees, and it wouldn't take a whole lot of editing to make the same exact case for not eating meat. And if we were to do that, in my altered version of Matthew 19, the Pharisees came to him and tried him and said to him, "Is it right to eat animals?" And he answered and said to them, "Did you not read that he who made them in the beginning gave them every plant that yields seed which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed for food? And Elohim saw all that he had made, and see, it was very good. So that the creation did not kill each other for food. Therefore, what Elohim has called food, let man not change." They said to him, "Why did Moses write that we can eat meat?" And he said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart, Moshe allowed you to eat meat, but from the beginning it was not so." Now, this may seem a little outrageous to sit here and change Yeshua's words and to make him say something that he never said. Well, I would postulate to you that Yeshua did actually say this. Keifa tells us that he did. And so at this point I would turn back to the Nazarene Acts, and I would just invite you to notice how it appears from the words of Keifa that Yeshua actually did say something very similar to this. Go into Book 1, Chapter 35. After this, Moshe, by the command of Yahuwah, whose providence is over all, led out the people of the Hebrews into the wilderness, and leaving the shortest road that leads from Mitzrayim to Judea, he led the people through the long windings of the wilderness, that by the discipline of 40 years, the novelty of a changed manner of life might root out the evils that had clung to them by a long continued familiarity with the customs of the Mitzrayim. So basically, Keifa saying that the reason they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness was because even though Moses had taken the Hebrews out of Egypt, he couldn't get Egypt out of the Hebrews. This is different from what we're told in the Pentateuch, which is that they were wandered in the wilderness because of punishment. But Keifa's saying it's actually for education, to try and purify them. And it took 40 years of Moses trying to get this Egyptian mindset out of the people. Continuing on, it says, "Meantime, they came to Mount Sinai, and from there Torah was given to them with voices and sights from heaven, written in 10 precepts, of which the first and greatest was they should worship Yahuwah himself alone, and not make to themselves any appearance of or form to worship. But when Moshe had gone up to the mount and was staying there 40 days, the people, Although they had seen Mitzrayim struck with the 10 plagues, and the sea parted and passed over by them on foot, manna also given to them from heaven for bread, and drink supplied to them out of the rock that followed them, which kind of food was turned into whatever taste anyone desired. And although being placed under the torrid region of heaven, they were shaded by a cloud in the daytime, that they might not be scorched by the heat, and by night were enlightened by a pillar of fire, lest the horror of darkness should be added to the vastness of the wilderness. Those very people, I say, when Moshe stayed on the mount, made and worshipped a golden calf's head, and the fashion of Apis, whom they have seen, worshipped in Mitzrayim. And after so many and so great marvels that they had seen, were unable to cleanse and wash out from themselves the defilements of old habit. Now, this is the hard-heartedness, right? This is why Moshe added the allowance for them to eat meat, was because of the hardness of their hearts. It was not because Yeshua had commanded it. On this account, leaving the short road that leads from Mitzrayim to Judea, Moshe conducted them by an immense circuit of the desert, so that if he might be able, as we mentioned before, to shake off the evils of old habit by the exchange of a new education, when meantime Moshe, that faithful and wise steward, perceived that the vice of sacrificing to idols had been deeply ingrained into the people from their association with the Mitzrayim, and that the root of this evil could not be extracted from them, he allowed them sacrifices, but permitted it to be done only to Yeshua, that by any means he might cut off one half of the deeply ingrained evil, leaving the other half to be corrected by another, and at a future time. By him, namely, concerning whom he said himself, a prophet will Yeshua your Elohim raise up unto you, whom you will hear, even as myself, according to all things that he will say to you. Whosoever will not hear that prophet, his spirit will be cut off from his people. So my theory, my hypothesis, that what Yeshua said about Moshe adding the commandment for a certificate of divorce because of the hardness of their hearts, that's actually kind of what Keifa's saying here. It was because of the hardness of their hearts, because they refused to put away the vice of sacrificing animals to idols, that Moshe permitted it to only be done to Yeshua for the purpose of rooting out half of this deeply ingrained idol. So even though it was fictitious what I did when I changed Yeshua's statement, you can actually see the truth of it reflected in the Nazarene Acts. And as a matter of fact, if we turn to the book of Leviticus chapter 17, if you read between the lines, it really sounds like that Leviticus is confirming what Keifa says in the first chapter, or the first book of the Nazarene Acts that we read just now. Leviticus 17, starting at verse 3, any man from the house of Israel who slaughters a bull or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or slaughters it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tent of meeting to bring an offering to Yeshua before the dwelling place of Yeshua, blood guilt is reckoned to that man. He has shed blood, and that man will be cut off from among his people. Now, if we stop right here, is this not an unusual thing to say about sacrificing an animal if there's nothing wrong with killing an animal? Blood guilt is reckoned on you because you have shed blood. You have shed the blood of an animal. Blood guilt is upon you. So if you don't read anything else except what's in the green, does it sound like slaying an animal is a good thing? Going on at verse 5, in order that the children of Israel bring their slaughterings which they slaughter in the open field, and they shall bring them to Yeshua at the door of the tent of meeting, to the priest, and slaughter them there as a peace offering to Yeshua. That to me sounds very similar to what Keifa just said, that Moshe permitted it to be done to Yeshua because He didn't perceive that there was any other way to root out this evil. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of Yahuwah at the door of the tent of meeting, and shall burn the fat for a sweet fragrance to Yahuwah. And let them no longer slaughter their slaughterings to demons after whom they whored. This is a law forever for them throughout their generations. Again, this sounds to me very similar to what Keifa just told us that he understood had happened in the wilderness. Now, I don't believe that Yahuwah commanded this. In fact, I don't necessarily even believe that Moshe allowed this. I think that, I mentioned that there's two different versions of this story. In the Nazarene Acts, it says that Moshe allowed it, which is what we just read. Now, in the Clementine Homilies, which is the Greek version of the Clementia, it says that Moses never allowed sacrifices, that after the death of Moses, the Torah was passed down orally, and at some point someone wrote it down. And once they wrote it down, wicked men began to insert falsehoods into the Torah, and among those falsehoods were the commandments for sacrifices. Now, personally, I lean more toward the story in the Homilies versus the Nazarene Acts. I don't think Moses ever allowed sacrifices. But just for the sake of exploring the other side of the argument, that's why I'm discussing this here. But the point of the matter, whether the Homilies is correct or whether the recognitions are correct, the point of the matter, the important thing is that Yahuwah never asked for it. He never wanted it. He never desired it. In fact, it says that he despises sacrifices. And if we look at verse 6 here, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of Yahuwah at the door of the tent of meeting, and shall burn the fat for a sweet fragrance to Yahuwah. That is completely opposed to what Isaiah tells us that Yahuwah said. In the first chapter of Isaiah, when you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courtyards? Speaking about bringing these animals, he says, stop bringing the futile offerings. The smoke is an abomination to me. Now, usually, as I mentioned before, in this verse 13, it says that the incense is an abomination. But if you actually look at the word for incense, look at the different meanings for it, it means smoke. It means the smell of the smoke. So basically what Yahuwah is saying is that the stench of the smoke is an abomination to him, as opposed to what Leviticus says, that the burning fat is a sweet fragrance. And personally, the things that matter to me is what's pleasing to Elohim. And what did Yeshua command? I mean, if Yeshua is the Messiah, if you're a believer in Yeshua, then you should put his testimony and his instructions above anything else. It was him that said, beware of the leaven of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And I believe this is that leaven, the sacrifices. And again, it's your duty to search this out. I try to give you every single reference that I quote on any of these videos. Every source I put on here so that you can research it yourself. You know, people will write me and ask me questions, and honestly, guys, you've got to study this out for yourself. I don't want you following me. I don't want you believing stuff I say just because I say it. I don't want you just watching these videos and not taking the time to read the Nazarene Acts for yourself, to do the research yourself. I mean, it's no different than when people are in church and all they ever do is just listen to the sermon every Friday, but they never pick the Bible up when they go home. And so all that they know is what their preacher tells them. I don't want you just to believe me because of what I say. I give you the truth. Now, if you reject it, it's the same thing as what Keifa says. That it's not his fault. It's not my fault if you perish. It's your own fault. And keep in mind that Keifa is the person that Yeshua said that he's going to give the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever Keifa binds on earth has been bound in the heavens. This doesn't mean that the Catholic Church has the authority to bind and loose. It says that Keifa does. And Keifa tells us in the Clementine writings, he says that he got his doctrine straight from Yeshua himself. He didn't make it up. So, by all means, you're under your own authority, and you can believe it, or you can choose to plug your ears up and like this wonderful illustration of this guy on the screen. But it's not my doctrine. I'm not making it up. I'm not just picking and choosing what I want to believe. Everything that I believe, everything that I teach is based upon what Keifa says. And what Keifa says is based upon what Yeshua said to him. And I'm going under the presumption, if you're watching these videos, you're a believer in Messiah, and that you've said the sinner's prayer, been baptized in the name of Yeshua, whatever salvation experience you had, but you had to have had some kind of salvation experience to have an interest in this subject. And the point of the matter is, if Yeshua is the Messiah, follow him. If he's not, if you just want to do straight Judaism, look, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want, if that's what you honestly believe is the answer. But don't fool yourself into thinking that you're going to follow Judaism in all respects and still claiming to be following the Messiah. It was the religious system of Judaism is what put our Messiah to death to begin with. It's what he came and argued against. Judaism was a creation of Babylon. It came from Babylon. It's not the same. The Jewish religion that was present in Judea prior to the Babylonian captivity was not the same as the Judaism when they were brought back. Yeshua came to restore them back to the original faith, the one that had been lost during the Babylonian captivity. And one of the major tools that they used to take the pure religion away from the people was the writings in the Pentateuch. And it was the Pentateuch that the early Nazarenes rejected, not the true Torah. They said that Moses was given a Torah, it was just not the Torah that is contained in the Pentateuch. They took the original pure Torah and added to it. So it's up to you to study that out or to just reject it, but I would suggest doing your homework before you reject it. So thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing to you, and I bid you shalom.